Okay, let's dive into this. Picture this. It's the evening of March 22nd, 1992. You're standing at New York's LaGuardia Airport. It's pitch black outside, it's absolutely freezing, and a steady, heavy snow is blanketing the tarmac. In this explainer, we're going to look at a deeply unsettling reality of complex systems. We are going to unpack the tragic story of USAir Flight 405. And as you'll see, we're going to track exactly how a chain of seemingly minor, everyday delays can silently cascade into an absolute catastrophe. To really understand how this happened, here's our investigation roadmap for today. First, we'll look at that snowy night in New York. Then, the de-icing dilemma, the long taxi, a fatal takeoff, and finally, the lasting legacy of Flight 405.
So part 1, a snowy night in New York.
Right, so setting the scene, it was a brutal -1 degree Celsius at LaGuardia. Visibility was incredibly poor, and traffic was just backed up everywhere. Boarding a relatively young 6-year-old Fokker F-28 aircraft were 47 passengers and crew, and they were eager to make what really should have been a routine 1.5-hour hop over to Cleveland, Ohio. But up in the cockpit, there was a pretty staggering contrast in experience. You had Captain Wallace Mauger, a seasoned veteran with nearly 10,000 flight hours, including over 2,000 on this exact aircraft type. He knew winter flying. But sitting to his right was First Officer John Ruba. Now, while Ruba had 4,500 hours of overall flying time, he was incredibly new to the Fokker F-28. I mean, he had just 29 hours on this specific plane. So you've got this highly asymmetric cockpit operating in rapidly deteriorating icy weather conditions.
Moving on to part 2, the de-icing dilemma. The flight was already running an hour behind schedule because of the weather up and down the East Coast, and the crew knew ice was their absolute biggest enemy tonight. So, as they prepped to leave the gate, they requested the standard treatment, a spray of hot water and glycol to clear the wings. And this brilliantly illustrates a massive, systemic blind spot in U.S. aviation at the time. Broadly speaking, there are 2 types of fluid. Over in Europe, they have been successfully using anti-icing fluid, which actively prevents new ice from forming. But in the United States, and specifically at LaGuardia that night, they only stocked de-icing fluid. This type, known as Type 1 fluid, only removes the ice that's already there. It does practically nothing to stop new snow from sticking the literal second the truck drives away. And that is exactly what Flight 405 was sprayed with.
Which makes this timeline of gate delays all the more agonizing. So after their first de-icing, they're ready to push back. But in a really cruel twist of irony, one of the de-icing struts actually breaks down right behind the plane, physically trapping them at the gate. And as they sit there waiting for the broken truck to be towed away, the snow just keeps falling. By the time the path is clear, 20 minutes have passed, and the pilots know their wings are likely contaminated again. So they do the right thing. They make the responsible call. They ask for a second de-icing.
This brings us to part 3, the long taxi.
Finally, dripping with a fresh, hot coat of fluid, they are cleared to head toward runway 13. But because of the weather, LaGuardia was a total mess. As they began this tortuously slow crawl to the runway, compounding pressures really started stacking up on the crew. First, an incoming plane actually skidded down runway 22 due to the ice, which prompted air traffic control to shut that runway down completely. So now, all arriving and departing traffic was shifted to the single runway Flight 405 was waiting for, runway 13. Naturally, the line of planes grew massively. And the pilots? Well, they were caught in this psychological trap. If they abandoned the line and went back to the gate to de-ice a third time, they would legally exceed their maximum allowed crew duty hours. The flight would have to be canceled, straining everybody in New York. But, on the flip side, pressing forward meant sitting in the freezing snow for a completely unknown amount of time.
Ultimately, they decided to stay in line. But hovering over them was an official rule from the USAir Cold Weather Manual, which stated, if the elapsed time since de-icing exceeded 20 minutes, careful examination of the wings and tail is required. This rule was literally written to keep them alive. And as they sat in that massive departure queue, that 20-minute mark had long since passed. So how exactly did they fulfill this careful examination? Well, this brings us to a tragic reality of airline culture back then. The manual left the interpretation of the word careful entirely up to the captain. Did it mean walking into the cabin to look closely? Did it mean having the ground crew physically touch the wing? Nope. The widespread pilot interpretation at the time was simply shining a light and looking out the cockpit window. So the pilots pressed their faces to the glass, looking 30 feet back into a dark snowstorm, trying to see if a little black inspection strip on the wing was visible. They saw the black strip and tragically concluded they were ice-free.
So, the crucial point here comes down to a really devastating number: 11 minutes. What the pilots didn't know, and honestly what they couldn't have known without modern charts, is that in those specific weather conditions, the Type 1 fluid they were sprayed with only protected their wings for 11 minutes. By the time they finally reached the front of the line, they had been sitting in the falling snow for 33 minutes. That is 3 times longer than the fluid was actually effective.
Let's look at Part 4, a fatal takeoff.
It's now 9:34 p.m. 33 minutes after their second de-icing, they are finally cleared to line up and wait on runway 13. But here's the thing about their specific aircraft, it was highly vulnerable. While they had sat there and watched other planes take off ahead of them in the snow with zero issues, most of those other planes had something the Fokker F-28 lacked, slats. Flaps, which are at the rear of the wing, help generate lift. But slats, located at the very front, physically extend out to make the wing bigger and more curved, which allows the plane to point its nose much higher without stalling. The Fokker F-28 just didn't have slats. It relied purely on the clean, engineered shape of its wing. And that meant this specific aircraft had a severely reduced margin for error in icy conditions.
Now, that margin for error is all about preventing an aerodynamic stall. A stall happens when the wing's angle into the wind gets too steep, causing the smooth air to literally disconnect from the top of the wing. When that happens, the wing stops acting like a wing. It just becomes a piece of falling metal. And here's the truly terrifying truth. A layer of rough ice, barely the thickness of sandpaper, on the top of a wing without slats will drastically lower the angle at which a stall occurs.
So with sandpaper-thick ice silently coating their wings, they begin their takeoff roll. The initial 80 knots check goes totally fine. Next is V1, which is the speed where you can no longer safely abort the takeoff. Based on the plane's weight, V1 should be 124 knots. But, wanting to be extra conservative on a slippery runway, the captain modifies V1, lowering it to 110 knots. However, the final step, VR, which is the speed at which you actually pull back the yoke to fly, that remains at 124 knots.
Now, normally V1 and VR are the exact same speed on this plane, so pilots get into this deeply ingrained habit of calling out V1 rotate in the exact same breath. When they hit that artificially lowered V1 of 110 knots, the first officer reverted to pure habit. He immediately called rotate, way too early. The captain hesitated, knowing it was early, but the prompt worked its way into his hands anyway. He pulled back on the yoke at 119 knots, just 5 knots before he was supposed to. In a normal plane, this wouldn't matter at all. But with wings covered in ice, completely lacking front slats, this tiny 5-knot error pushed the plane entirely beyond its aerodynamic limit.
The airflow over those frozen wings immediately separated. They were airborne for just 13 terrifying seconds. The instant they lifted off, the control column began shaking violently, which is a mechanical warning of an impending stall. The captain desperately tried to keep the nose shallow, but the heavily ice-left wing completely stopped generating lift. The aircraft rolled violently to the left, hit a water pump house, and tumbled inverted into the freezing dark waters of Flushing Bay. 27 people lost their lives that night.
Which brings us to our final section, the legacy of Flight 405. The sheer senselessness of this tragedy. I mean, the fact that highly trained pilots operating completely within the rules of the day could still end up in the water, it forced the global aviation industry to completely overhaul its winter operations. Let's move to how this builds the incredibly safe system we have today. The industry mandated a strict clean aircraft concept, meaning absolutely no amount of ice is acceptable. They largely abandoned relying solely on Type 1 de-icing fluid in the US and spread the use of European-style anti-icing fluids that prevent buildup. Furthermore, they got rid of that vague, careful examination rule and replaced flawed human judgment with hard data, pilot holdover tables that tell crews exactly, down to the minute, how long their fluid lasts. And finally, airports began building de-icing pads right next to the runways so you get sprayed just seconds before taking off, totally eliminating that long, dangerous wait entirely.
These systemic changes saved countless lives after Flight 405. But I want to leave you with this final provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. By formalizing every single rule and adding all these layers of technology, have we truly eliminated all the invisible links in the chain of disaster? Or, in our incredibly complex modern world, are we always just waiting for the next unforeseeable combination of minor delays to align? It is definitely something to think about the next time you're sitting on a snowy tarmac. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the systems around you.